French police have clashed with protesters in Paris demonstrating against planned pension reforms by the government of President Emmanuel Macron. Police fired tear gas and stun grenades at demonstrators in central Paris. Protesters, meanwhile, overturned bins, tried to smash advertisements, and hurled projectiles at police. Tens of thousands of rail workers, nurses, teachers, and public service employees had earlier in the day marched peacefully throughout the capital. Similar, largely peaceful but occasionally violent protests were also held in other cities such as Marseille and Nantes. Nationwide protests, coupled with transport strikes, have wreaked mayhem throughout France. However, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe defiantly says that the government is determined to implement the pension reform plans.
We have clearly stated our project, clearly what our project is. And on this project, on the creation of a universal pension system, my determination, that of the government and that of the entire majority, is total. I'm saying this clearly, total.
Police say that over 600,000 people attended the nationwide rallies called by various unions. On Tuesday, it was almost double the figure for the turnout just a week ago. Pension reforms seek to prod people to work until the age of 64 instead of the average current retirement age of 62. Unions and the government each are trying to push the other back down before Christmas. Some major unions have ruled out the option of a holiday break. And joining us now for this news review is our own Press TV correspondent out of Paris, Rami Mazaheri, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Rami, we're going to start with you to get the latest. Go ahead, bud.
Well, day 13 was the biggest labor action yet. You had some people saying as many as 2 million people. And this makes sense because the nation's largest union finally joined the protest against the junking of France's pension system. It's going to be the world's first universal one-size-fits-all pension system. So it's obviously a very radical reform. But the biggest news occurred the night before, and it's like something out of Hollywood. The minister in charge of the pension reforms, he had to quit. He has just resigned due to corruption allegations. He has been getting huge salaries from the private sector while holding a public post, and that is against France's constitution. And it's pretty shocking that he wouldn't know such a thing. So, you know, in an effort to save his pension reform, this is the key architect. He's been working on it for the past 2 years. In an effort to try and save this reform, he has quit. But obviously, people are saying is that, you know, his pension ideas are totally tainted. You know, how can they possibly allow his ideas to govern, you know, something that will touch every single person in France? So, you know, back to the, you know, that shocker aside, back to what happened today, it's the biggest protest France has had yet. You know, something that has not happened before. Energy workers publicly cut off power to over 200,000 homes. So, and this is something that is expected to continue. The energy workers wanted to show the nation what's going to happen if they decide to stop working. Obviously, it's a very big deal. You have public transport workers, once again, cutting off about 80% of the nation's trains. As you mentioned, there's not going to be any sort of Christmas truce. That deadline passed yesterday, so at least 60% of trains will be idled during the key pre-holiday travel days. So the general strike shows no signs of stopping, and the shocking corruption scandals of Macron are going to be very possibly a decisive blow against his pension rollback. Last thing I'll say, Macron is only halfway through his term. He has already set the record for the greatest number of minister resignations. The vast majority are due to corruption. Macron, you know, beating Marine Le Pen was the main thing, but number two was ending the corruption of the two mainstream parties. You know, you can say that his tenure is the most corrupt one yet.
Now, Tony, with respect to pension reforms, I mean, we're seeing in almost every country nowadays. We're seeing the retirement age getting bumped back. Why are we seeing this kind of reaction of this magnitude in France?
Well, first of all, it's only 20 miles from the UK. Most of the trips abroad, many anyway, certainly go through France from here in the UK. We've got lots of ferry connections. We've obviously got the Channel Tunnel as well. So the connections with France, really, they're our main partner on the continent, next door, really. And yet there's been almost no proper coverage of this anywhere on our TV broadcast news, on our radio news. And it's nearly 2 weeks now that the general strike has been going on in France. Must mention as well that the British government, the Conservative government, and a new, much bolstered government, very much sets itself against unions. Many of the strikes over the last couple of years in this country have been banned. A general strike like this is happening in France would be a criminal offence here in Britain. So the so-called mother of parliaments has worked very hard to make sure that the trade unions don't actually get a foothold at all and don't have the power that they once had. Certainly back in the 1970s and the 1980s, the power of the unions was enormous. We could bring the country to a standstill in a similar way that is happening in France now, but that's now not possible in the UK. Also, the unions are very hot on two things. My experience of trade unions is that quite a lot of it is just talk, but there are two things that get members coming into meetings and people take very seriously who are part of unions. One is car parking outside where they work, and the other one is pensions. And what the French government are trying to do here is to force through stealing 2 years of these people's lives, of their pensionable time, and this is bound to cause all sorts of trouble. Interesting as well that the minister has resigned. It's a bit, I think, most probably a cover story to say this is to do with corruption. He just simply wants to distance himself from Macron, and Macron is becoming increasingly isolated in France. I mean, he never really was wanted much by the French people. He was kind of imposed on them, and I think what's happening is that the whole of the French society is slowly coalescing towards doing everything they possibly can to remove the president. And we'll see, if they manage to get anywhere with that in the next few weeks, because this is going to dominate Christmas in France for many people. The fact that there's no transportation, it's a provocation to not negotiate, to say this is now non-negotiable. Really, they're asking for almost a fight to the very end. The government are seeing themselves as the masters, the financial masters of the country, and the ordinary people are now doing everything they can to get their rights back, simply to take on the government. The government should be the servant. This time it's become the master, at least it's attempting to, and I think in France that is going to end in tears.
And now today, I mean, are the French more, would you say, frustrated with austerity, or are they more frustrated with Macron's leadership?
Well, I think that, you have to look at the two together, but I would say overall, if you're asking, it would be austerity, because that has gone on for 10 years. Macron's refusal to negotiate, and the government will start negotiations tomorrow, but his, refusal to negotiate or compromise, the total control he has over his parliament, the way that he can force through anything on his, bunch of newbie parliamentarians, his imperiousness, it's certainly very aggravating, but much more than his personal style, it's the fact that it's been 10 years of decreased purchasing power, reduced government services, those costs pushed onto people, a gutted labor code, and now a two-tier pension. This pension system, it's going to fall entirely on everyone born after 1975. So it's mostly economic, but Macron's attitude and the way that he goes about things certainly doesn't help.
Antonio, your final thoughts on this before we wrap it up.
Well, I mean, one of the most interesting interventions I've seen is General Pierre de Villiers. I'm sure you're close to that as well. He is saying you must restore order. He's a former senior military chief in France, and he's come out publicly and said that order must be restored. So he's set a challenge to Macron. And really, that actually could be taken two ways. So it could be either we need a clampdown, a kind of police and military clampdown on these strikes, an attack on the strikers, and of course The right to strike is enshrined in international law, as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right to withdraw people's labour is an absolute right. So if he does that, he's setting himself against human rights. But the other thing is he could be paying the strikers a backhanded compliment. He could be saying, well, you can restore order by agreeing to some of the terms and pulling back from the brink on these pension reforms and starting to think that through again. That would also restore order. So maybe that's what the military are saying quietly to Macron is, come on, you need to negotiate.
Gentlemen, good stuff. Thank you both for joining us. Rami Mazaheri out of Paris and Mr. Tony Gosling there joining us from Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thanks for tuning in and goodbye for now.